Since we've all been kids at some point in our lives, and many of us have been parents as well, we all understand the benefit that fairy tales and fables bring to the table as they easily communicate a deeper truth through the telling of a simple story. For instance, The Ant and the Grasshopper is a simple fable about two bugs. The ant demonstrates hard work ethic and planning and the ability to foresee tragedy that could occur and to mitigate that potential tragedy through preparation. And then from the grasshopper, we learn that procrastination and apathy and laziness lead to a miserable winter of starvation out in the elements. In fact, that particular fable was written by Aesop, who lived during the time of the Assyrian and Chaldean captivities of the divided kingdom of Israel. So 2,500 years later, we still benefit from the timeless principles of Aesop and his wit and his fables as he used these simple fables to communicate deeper truths. In Romans 11, Paul uses a similar strategy. He takes the picture of an olive tree and branches being pruned out and other branches being grafted in to describe what is happening with the salvation of Gentiles, contrasted with the ultimate rejection of the Messiah by the Jews, who we might say were God's original chosen people. And I'll just begin this lesson by saying there exist multiple views of how we are to understand Paul's imagery regarding the olive tree and these branches. Now, it is never my intent to get too technical. However, depending on how one interprets the olive tree and the branches will impact how he interprets many other things in this and other chapters of the Bible. So let me shed a little light on some terms that you have heard in the past to help us understand where these different interpretations come from. Within evangelical Christianity, there are two overarching interpretational views that affect our interpretation of God's salvific grace to his chosen people. The first is Reformed or covenant theology. You've all heard of that. For our purposes today, this means of study and interpretation finds an unbroken link between the promises and the covenant Jehovah made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and the New Testament church after the vicarious death and resurrection of Jesus. They would view the New Testament church as an extension of Israel, maybe like a 13th tribe. You know, they're almost one and the same. Now, to do so, they have to incorporate a little allegory into the narrative, because the Abrahamic covenant included promises regarding three things: the blessing of the blessing of extreme multiplication of Abraham's descendants, i.e., the literal Jewish people. Number two, it included the physical promise of land east of the Mediterranean, and thirdly, it included the promise that all the world would be blessed through the seed of Abraham. Now, assuming that that promise is referring to the Messiah, who would bless the world by providing salvation from sin and reconciliation to the Creator, there's no issue with that one. But how do Christians today partake in what seems to be a very literal land promise, or a literal ancestry line of Abraham? It's a little hard to do unless something of the land is allegorized or takes on a double meaning of some kind. So the response to this, a much more recent response, is another view of interpretation called dispensationalism, which will conclude that there are distinct differences in how God dealt with and deals with Israel today and with the New Testament church today. That is, throughout different dispensations of time, God has displayed his grace to his chosen people, whether Jews prior to or after the cross, or Gentiles primarily after the cross. And God does so without any level of inconsistency whatsoever. So, when we come to the olive branch picture in Romans 11, I'll do my best to summarize what Paul is portraying. The olive tree as a whole are the people God has shown his covenant mercy to in time past, to this point in Romans 11. And to that point in human history, this is 99% the Hebrew nation, the descendants of Abraham, with a couple exceptions like Rahab the harlot or Ruth the Moabite, both who found themselves in Jesus' genealogy, by the way. So for Paul's purposes, this olive tree, to this point, representing those who benefit from the covenants of God, are primarily Jewish. But after the cross, what happened for the Gentiles, for the non-Jews? Well, several things happened. First, because of the blood of Christ, any partition between God and man was removed. And this was indicated by the veil between the holy place and the Holy of Holies being torn from top to bottom. The message of salvation was universal and did not apply solely to the select group of humanity called the Hebrews. But we also see national rejection of the Messiah. Yes, a few thousand Jews in early Acts come to Jesus as Messiah, but the majority of Jews reject Jesus as Messiah and remained within Judaism. Those events actually lead to the events of Acts 10, where God overtly opens access of salvation to all Gentiles, to all peoples in the entire world. So this leads us back to the olive branch picture. Paul says in verse 17 that some of the branches were broken off and that the Gentiles, pictured as wild olive shoots, were grafted in, able now to share in the nourishing root of the olive tree. And we see how covenantal theology and dispensational theology can both be supported by this imagery. That's what makes it so confusing of which one of these is correct, or is there something in between the two that is actually the most accurate. Those of the covenantal camp would point to the grafting in of the Gentiles, the New Testament church, as they're becoming one under the covenantal promises God made with Abraham. In this context of Romans 11, that can be supported. Those who would see God's grace as distinctively effective in different periods of time can point to the cutting out and the grafting in as distinctly different wild olive shoots to show how New Testament believers, though not part of the original plan, are now able to draw sustenance from God's promises as they were originally given to the patriarchs. So that view can also be supported. And hopefully that helps address the elephant in this chapter. We also must never forget that God has not forsaken Israel permanently. They have endured incredible persecution, both during the dispersions throughout the Roman Empire mentioned in the New Testament and other secular historical books and accounts, but also more recently during the Holocaust and other conflicts against Arab nations, etc. They don't possess the full expanse of land that was promised in Deuteronomy and Joshua. In fact, they are nowhere close. But look what Paul says in verses 11 and 12. So I ask, did the Jews stumble in order that they might fall permanently? By no means. Rather, through their trespass, salvation has come to the Gentiles so as to make Israel jealous. Now, if their trespass means riches for the world, and it does, and if their failure means salvific and eternal riches for the Gentiles, and it does, how much more will their full inclusion mean? In other words, yes, some branches were cut out and Gentile branches were grafted in. However, there still remains the promise of full inclusion for the Jews. For more on that, the book of Revelation is a good place to start. Ezekiel as well has more on that. We don't have time today to get into all of that, but there is still a promise of full inclusion for the Jews in the future. Now, these past 4 studies in particular have contained some pretty deep stuff. Anytime we put covenant theology next to dispensationalism or God's sovereign grace next to the free will of man, we find ourselves in a state of mental claustrophobia. And that's okay. Look at verse 33. Because Paul declares, "Oh, the depth of the riches and wisdom and knowledge of God. How unsearchable are his judgments and how inscrutable are his ways." Notice 2 things in closing today. There is an unsearchable depth to the wisdom and knowledge of God that I don't believe humans are able to grasp this side of eternity. Now, disclaimer, that is Matt's personal opinion. Feel free to differ. But then number 2, we are dealing with the ways of God, the God of the universe. How unsearchable are his judgments? How inscrutable are his ways? And when we get to the end of the chapter, Paul brilliantly refocuses our attention back to where it should be. For from him and through him, and to him were all things. To him be glory forever. Amen. It is all about God's glory.